It's a standard ploy, let me tell you. 3 days out from an election, the side that's behind releases confidential polling showing that it's ahead in key marginal seats in order to keep up morale. And the side that's really ahead also releases secret polling showing shock horror that it still might lose in order to combat complacency and tactical voting, especially when voting is not compulsory, as is the case in Britain. And that's exactly what's happening now in the UK in the run-up to Thursday's vote. Labor says it's still in a position to form a Brexit-blocking minority government, and the Conservatives say they're not ahead in enough Labor marginals to be confident of winning. But as anyone who's ever run a campaign knows, the important thing, of course, is not to put too much faith in polls, but to have the best policies, the best candidates and the best campaign and the best effort to push on regardless. Elections matter because good governments improve countries and bad governments send them backwards. Elections in countries like Britain matter because trends there tend to be replicated here, and because Britain is still one of Australia's most important security and economic partners. And this election is the most important British election in many decades, not just because it will determine whether the UK finally does or does not leave the European Union, but because it will decide whether the modern birthplace of democracy elects a Marxist government 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the supposed triumph of liberal democracy. It's that important. It's hard to overstate just how much of a political misfit now leads the British Labor Party. Not for nothing has Jeremy Corbyn never ever made it to the front bench in the Labor Party in more than 20 years in the Parliament. No leader ever trusted him enough or his wacky views to give him any responsibility. But then to give itself some credibility, after losing what it thought was the unlosable election, Labor allowed a plebiscite of everyone who'd paid not much more than a few pounds to elect its leader. And this Venezuela-admiring, IRA sympathiser and avowed anti-Semite emerged from nowhere as now the alternative PM of one of the world's most important countries. Then, at the previous election, Corbyn was written off as unelectable and miles behind in the polls, but forced the Tories into minority government on the back of a strong youth vote and the promise to abolish all university fees. And he survived, despite the resignation of many of his front bench, including the deputy leader, over his total failure to combat growing anti-Jewish prejudice inside the British Labor Party. Now, this election, Corbyn's gone even further, promising not just totally free education and healthcare, but a 4-day working week with no reduction in pay. Seriously, I mean, these promises might be called free to the individual at the very least, but it's the British taxpayer who'll have to stump up the cost if Corbyn wins. It's utter fiscal madness. Then there's the renationalisation of industry, punitive taxes on the middle class and the confiscation of assets belonging to private schools. In all probability, if elected, he'll scrap the nuclear deterrent and end the Five Eyes security alliance. This would amount to a social and economic revolution. But again, people who've had it pretty good for a long time and have no memory of the misery that socialism and communism inflicted on people seem to have this warped nostalgia for the Soviet era. And the only way Corbyn won't emerge as the improbable leader of a minority government is if Boris Johnson wins a majority in his own right. And improving its position is hard for any government seeking a fourth term. I kid you not, Thursday's UK election is that important, not just for the people of Britain, but for people everywhere who value the contribution that Western civilisation has made and must still make to the modern world. Then, of course, there's the question of Brexit. Despite the near universal opposition of the establishment, the British people voted to leave the EU. And since then, There's been a non-stop campaign of sabotage, and Corbyn is the candidate of everyone who wants Britain to stay in Europe, regardless of the people's vote after vote, to leave. I know that life goes on regardless of any election result, anywhere. But this one really does matter, and many things will be worse if such a manifestly unsuitable candidate takes on such a position of global power and influence. Australia and the world can only hope that the British people get it right.